Hello, my name is John, and today we'll be reading The Strategic Case for Kurdistan, Why It May Weaken U.S. Adversaries and Strengthen Our Allies, by Carolyn Glick on FrontPage magazine, September 1st, 2017. Carolyn Glick is the director of the David Horowitz Freedom Center's Israel Security Project and the senior contributing editor of the Jerusalem Post. This article was originally posted in the Jerusalem Post. If the leaders of Iraqi Kurdistan aren't intimidated into standing down on September 25th, the people of Iraqi Kurdistan will go to the polls to vote on a referendum for independence. The Kurds have been hoping to hold the referendum since 2013. Whereas Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu restated his support for Kurdish independence earlier this month in a meeting with a delegation of visiting Republican congressmen. The Trump administration has urged Kurdish President Masoud Barzani and his colleagues to postpone the referendum indefinitely. U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis, who visited with Barzani in the Kurdish capital of Erbil 2 weeks ago, said that the referendum would harm the campaign against the Islamic State. In his words, "Our point right now is to stay focused like a laser beam on the defeat of ISIS and to let nothing distract us." Another line of argument against the Kurdish referendum was advanced several weeks ago by the New York Times editorial board. The Times argued the Kurds aren't ready for independence. Their government suffers from corruption, their economy is weak, their democratic institutions are weak, and their human rights record is far from perfect. While the Times claims have truth to them, the relevant question is compared to what? Compared to their neighbors? Not to mention to the Times' favorite group, the Palestinians. The Kurds, who have been self-governing since 1991, are paragons of good virtue. Not only have they given refuge to tens of thousands of Iraqis fleeing ISIS, Iraqi Kurdistan has been an island of relative peace in a war-torn country since the U.S.-led invasion in 2003. Its Peshmerga forces have not only secured Kurdistan, they have been the most competent force fighting ISIS since its territorial conquests in 2014. The same is the case of the Kurdish YPG militia in Syrian Kurdistan. As for Mattis's argument that the referendum and any subsequent moves to secede from Iraq would harm the campaign against ISIS, the first question is whether he is right. If Mattis is concerned that the referendum will diminish Iranian and Turkish support for the campaign, then his concern is difficult to defend. Turkey has never been a significant player in the anti-ISIS campaign. Indeed, until recently, Turkey served as ISIS's logistical base. As for Iran, this week, Iranian-controlled Hezbollah and Lebanese military forces struck a deal to permit ISIS fighters they defeated along the Lebanese-Syrian border to safely transit Syria to ISIS-held areas along the Syrian border with Iraq. In other words, far from cooperating with the U.S. and its allies against ISIS, Iran and its underlings are fighting a separate war to take ISIS out of their areas of influence while enabling ISIS to fight the U.S. and its allies in other areas. This then brings us to the real question the U.S. should be asking itself in relation to the Kurdish referendum. That question is whether an independent Kurdistan would advance or harm U.S. strategic interests in the region. Since the U.S. and Russia concluded their ceasefire deal for Syria on July 7th, Netanyahu has used every opportunity to warn that the ceasefire is a disaster. In the interest of keeping Mattis's laser focus on fighting ISIS, the U.S. surrendered its far greater strategic interests of preventing Iran and its proxies from taking over the areas that ISIS controlled, such as the Syrian-Lebanese border and the tri-border area between Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. As Netanyahu warns at every opportunity, Iran and its proxies are moving into all the areas being liberated from ISIS, and Iran isn't the only concern from either an Israeli or an American perspective. Turkey is also a looming threat, which will only grow if it is not contained. Turkey's rapidly accelerating anti-American trajectory is now unmistakable. Last week, during Mattis's visit to Ankara, Turkish-supported militias in northern Syria opened fire on U.S. forces. Not only did Turkey fail to apologize, Turkey condemned the U.S. for retaliating against the attackers. Moreover, last week, Turkish authorities announced they are charging U.S. pastor Andrew Brunson with espionage, membership in a terrorist organization, and attempting to destroy Turkey's constitutional order and overthrow its parliament. Brunson was arrested last October. Whereas until last year, failed military coup against the regime of President Erdogan, Turkey demonstrated a firm interest in remaining a member of NATO and a strategic ally of the U.S. Since the failed coup, Turkey has signaled that at best, it is considering its options. U.S. generals say that since the failed coup, they have almost no one to talk to in the Turkish military. Their interlocutors are either under arrest or too afraid to speak to them. The regime and its supporters express both neo-Ottoman and neo-colonial aspirations, both of which place Turkey on a collision course with the U.S. For instance, Malaya Ersotas, the head of Erdogan's AK party's youth wing, proclaimed that Erdogan is not merely the president of Turkey, rather he is a president of all world Muslims. So too, Muslim Brotherhood leader Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi called Erdogan the hope of all Muslims and of Islam. Qaradawi, who lives in Qatar and is Qatar's Al Jazeera satellite channel superstar preacher, has good reason to love Erdogan. In June, Erdogan decided to make a strategic move to protect the pro-Muslim Brotherhood and pro-Iranian Qatari regime from its angry neighbors, led by Saudi Arabia. Turkey's deployment of forces to Doha stalled the Saudi-led campaign against the Qatari regime. If the regime survives, and if world oil prices continue to drop and so weaken Saudi economic power, Turkey's decision to deploy its forces to Qatar could be the first step toward realizing its neo-Ottoman ambitions. As for neo-imperialism, last October, Foreign Policy reported that Turkish television now uses a map from 1918 to find Turkey's current borders, from 1918 through 1920. Turkish territory included large portions of Iraq, among them Kurdistan and Mosul, as well as large swaths of Syria, including Aleppo. Foreign Policy reported that the use of the map indicates that as the post-World War I map of the Middle East becomes obsolete, Erdogan sees an opportunity to expand Turkish territory. Then there are Erdogan's moves to build strategic ties with Russia and Iran. Last November, the NATO member announced it is negotiating the purchase of an S-400 air defense system from Russia. As for Iran, last week, Major General Mohammad Hossein Bagheri, Iran's Chief of General Staff, paid the first official visit by an Iranian army chief to Turkey since the 1979 revolution. Bagheri met not only by his Turkish counterpart, General Hulusi Akkar, but with Erdogan as well. Both sides stressed that if the Kurdish referendum would be held, it will be the basis for the start of a series of tensions and conflicts inside Iraq, the consequences of which will affect neighboring countries. Bagheri continued, holding the referendum will get Iraq, but also Iran and Turkey involved, and that's why the authorities of the two countries emphasize that it's not possible and should not be done. This then brings us back to Israel and the U.S., and why Netanyahu is right to support Kurdish independence, and the Trump administration is wrong to oppose it. So long as there is no significant change in the nature of the Iranian and Turkish regimes, their empowerment will come at the expense of the U.S., Israel, and Arab Sunni states. The Kurds, with their powerful and experienced military forces in Iraq and Syria alike, constitute a significant check on both Iranian and Turkish power. Several commentators argue that the Turks will respond to the Kurdish referendum by waging a war of annihilation against the Kurds in Iraq and beyond. Iran, they warn, will assist in Turkish efforts. According to analysis by Al Monitor, published last September, the first 4 rounds of purges in the immediate aftermath of the failed coup reduced the number of general officers by nearly 40%. The ratio of pilots to aircraft in the Turkish Air Force was reduced from more than 3 pilots per plane to less than 1 pilot per plane. While Al Monitor assessed last year that it will take up to 2 years for the Turkish Air Force to rebuild its pilot corps, last week it appeared that 2 years was a gross underestimation of the time required. Last week, the U.S. rejected a Turkish request to have Pakistani pilots fly Turkish F-16s. The request owed to the critical shortage of pilots in the Turkish Air Force. And Erdogan continues to purge his generals. In early August, he sacked the commanders of Turkish land forces and the Turkish Navy. Given the current state of Turkish forces on the one hand, and the battlefield competence of Kurdish forces, it is clear that the balance of the two forces has never been better for the Kurds. If Kurdistan becomes independent with U.S. and Israeli backing and survives, the implications for the longevity of the Erdogan regime, given the rapidly expanding size of the Kurdish minority in Turkey, are significant. Likewise for Iran. An independent Kurdistan in Iraq will serve to contain Iranian power in Syria and potentially destabilize the Iranian regime at home. In summary, then, opponents of Kurdish independence are correct. An independent Kurdistan will destabilize the region, but contrary to their claims, this is a good thing. For the first time since 2009, destabilization will benefit the U.S. and Israel and weaken Iran and Turkey. This video is a production of the School of the White Crane. My name is John Brooker, and you can reach me through commentary on this video or through my Gmail listed here. Please share this video with family and friends and on social media. May God richly bless you.